Good evening, everyone. The amazing thing about live streaming is you can do it remotely. So you can do it from the comfort of your own home. You don't have to be over here. So we actually are being live streamed to everybody, so say hello to all the people in the parish as well. And we'll still have some of the anchor parents coming down here as well. Let's begin, let's stand and we'll begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Today's the feast of St. Simon and Jude, two of the apostles. And of course, we know of St. Jude being the patron saint of those, the one you turn to when you're in desperate need. So we bring before God tonight all of our most important intentions, those things that we really are praying for, those people we're praying for. We offer them up to God. And we ask that as we speak about the Beatitudes tonight, which are about blessings, we pray that God blesses those, of course, that we hold dearest. And let us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, tonight, the topic that I was assigned and given is actually one that's I'm very happy to speak on tonight. Talk about the Beatitudes and also how the Beatitudes are lived in the lives of the saints. So we got two things I love talking about, the Beatitudes and the lives of the saints. First of all, if you're familiar with the Beatitudes, I'm sure, you will be very familiar with it Sunday as it is Sunday's Gospel. So you're going to hear that. So I have to give a great homily on that. I'm not going to do that tonight, but this will help me prepare for the weekend. The reason why is because Sunday is the Feast of All Saints. So we celebrate that holy day of obligation when it falls on a Sunday. We celebrate it on the Sunday. So it'll displace the regular readings that day. And the gospel for All Saints' Day is the Beatitudes. So it's perfectly fitting today to speak of these things. Now, the Beatitudes, of course, are found in the Gospel of Matthew. And then they're also repeated in the Gospel of Luke. So they're found in both those Gospels. But probably we're more familiar with the Matthew Beatitudes because of their placement at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is that very important teaching of Jesus. It's chapter 5, chapter 6, and half of chapter 7 of the Gospel of Matthew is one long sermon of Jesus speaking to this collected crowd on the mountaintop. And it is an essential document. The Sermon on the Mount is kind of almost the Christian manifesto. It's what Christians believe, and it's how we live. And Jesus, I don't think he meant it that way. He didn't mean it as a challenge. He meant it as just who we are, what we're about, and how we live. The word beatitude is the word for blessing. So when Jesus uses that word, he's saying, blessed are you. You know, when he says, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who seek after righteousness. You see, in the Jewish perspective of Jesus' day, when you blessed someone, or when you said someone was blessed, that was the highest compliment. That means God smiled upon them. So it's like the best place you want to be is blessed by God. So when Jesus says the word beatitude or blessing, he's speaking very highly that this is God smiling upon you. Now there's an opposite word, and the opposite word is woe, W-O-E, woe. We think of woe as sort of like sorrow or sadness or turmoil sometimes. Woe is the opposite of blessing. So it's almost like God's face is turned away from you with a woe. In the Gospel of Luke version of the Beatitudes, he's got 4 Beatitudes and 4 woes. So he's got them balanced, the good and the bad. Matthew just has the 9 Beatitudes. So place that teaching in context, especially the Sermon on the Mount as we understand it. Jesus is confronted by a crowd. Now, it's not an angry crowd. It's not an insolent crowd. It's not a rebellious crowd. It's just a large group of people. And it's the kind of crowd Jesus looks at and he feels pity for them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. They're looking for something. They're longing for something. And he gathers them to him. And you can almost see the shepherd gathering the sheep. You know, bringing them close to him, and it's in this context that he teaches them. He sits. It says he sat. And this is, of course, in the ancient world, the way of teaching. The chair was the seat of authority. An emperor, a ruler, a judge would sit in a chair and dispense their wisdom and their judgment. And so when Jesus sits, it conveys that in the people's minds that he has authority. If you've been to the cathedral, you've seen the bishop's chair. The word cathedral is the building where the chair is. Because the Latin word for chair, that episcopal chair, the bishop, is cathedra. So the cathedral is the building where the chair is. And it's the bishop's chair, his authority, that he speaks out of. Bishop Aquila very often gives his homilies while seated in the chair. So again, that image of that authority. So this is what Jesus does. And I'm sure the people would have picked up on that immediately. The crowds that gather around Jesus throughout the Bible are thirsty for healing. They're thirsty for some kind of light in their lives, some kind of direction, happiness. They're looking for those things, and they'll traverse distances to find it. They'll come and find Jesus. They follow him out into desert areas, to mountaintops, to be in his presence, to be able to listen to him. He responds to that thirst. Jesus always does. He responds to those folks. He sees them as sheep without a shepherd. He gives those suffering people a magnificent promise of happiness, a promise repeated 9 times in the Beatitudes, but in language that's really very different from what we might expect. Now, when we think, we want to be blessed, we think of all the good things, right? And Jesus speaks about suffering, and he speaks about meekness, and he speaks about mourning, and it's in a way that is unexpected in the Beatitudes. What he proposes isn't really a human happiness, or not how humanity would define happiness. Maybe the image of happiness that we're accustomed to. But he preaches an unexpected happiness, encountered in situations and attitudes not normally associated with happiness. For example, mourning. That's a great one. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. We don't think of mourning as something we want to embrace, something we want to go looking for. And yet in that unexpected, unaccustomed place, Jesus says there is a blessing and ultimately happiness. So what Jesus does is he gives those suffering people, and they were really suffering. They were longing for something. He gives them a magnificent promise of happiness. And it's repeated again 9 times. And it's found in their everyday life. They don't have to do anything extraordinary for it. Mourning finds you, rather. You don't go out and find mourning. But it's part of our lives. We all experience it. We all encounter it. And it's there that we're blessed because God is with us. Jesus is with us. So we know this happiness that people are longing for in this gospel is not really a human production. In other words, it's not a man-made happiness, but it's a surprise from God. That's what the beauty of the Beatitudes is. And it's granted precisely when and where we thought it impossible, granted precisely at the time that we need it. Now, in the context of Jesus' teaching throughout the Bible, with the Beatitudes really being the paramount, and the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus often preaches about happiness, and he preaches about joy. And joy is really a depth of happiness. I always say to people, happy is on the surface. I can be happy today and unhappy tomorrow. Have you had days like that? Maybe often. Happiness is like almost, I don't want to use the word it's an emotion because that's maybe not the right word, but it's a state that externally kind of things work on us and make us happy or make us unhappy. We're not in control sometimes of our happiness, but we're always in control of our joy because joy is so much more deep-seated. Joy is seated in a relationship with Christ, and it's found, and it doesn't get shaken. In the midst of sadness, joy is still present. And joy is a glimpse of heaven. That's what we're going to have and see in heaven. Remember in the Gospel of John, this is very important. In the Gospel of John where Jesus says, I come to bring you joy so that your joy may be complete. Your joy may be complete. He doesn't say, I'm bringing you happiness. I'm not going to make you happy. I'm bringing you joy. And the completion of joy is the kingdom. That's heaven. So Jesus knows what he's doing. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, he's really laying the groundwork, and with the Beatitudes especially. Jesus is speaking with real empathy for that crowd. Again, they're like sheep without a shepherd. He's moved with pity. He's empathetic to their state. And he addresses their life situations. And he does so for us as well. Now, the Beatitudes, again, are directed to this crowd, but they're also, speak to us also in the sense of service. Sort of what we offer, what we give. So they're not just who we are, but they're what we give. When Jesus preached the Beatitudes, he's speaking of the one true element which gives human existence its full meaning and its truth, which is a life in Christ, a relationship with Christ. And I mention again that Gospel of John. I come to give you joy and to give it to the full, that your joy may be complete. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is saying, here's the fullness of joy. I'm giving it to you. And I'm giving it to you so your life may be complete. This is true healing. We think about what we need for healing, and this is true healing, an unexpected healing that comes from God. Now I'm going to read to you the Gospel of the Beatitudes. And again, you're going to hear this Sunday at Mass. And it's from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 1 to 12. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he had sat down, his disciples came to him. He began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. If you counted those, there are 9 blessings there. And again, they're unexpected. And I'm sure the crowd, their ears perked up. They're saying, did he really say you have to be meek? It wasn't a highly regarded quality in the ancient world. Did he really say mourning is good? Did he really say we have to strive to be righteous, to be peacemakers, to be clean of heart? Do we have to really do that? Do all those things? Well, Jesus is saying yes. And as I mentioned, it's found in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Right after the Beatitudes comes, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. So that teaching continues, but it's all in the context of the Beatitudes. You begin with the blessings. You begin with all the ways in which you are blessed by God. Now, it's been said that the only person who totally lived the Beatitudes was Jesus himself, that he lived them and modeled them perfectly. Probably true. I have a book that you might want to check out. It's a really interesting book. Every year at Christmas, Bishop Aquila gives all the priests a book. I guess he's encouraging us to read, or to keep reading. And a couple of years ago, he gave us this book. And actually, I picked it up after about a year of it sitting on my shelf. It's called The 8 Doors of the Kingdom. The 8 Doors of the Kingdom. Meditations on the Beatitudes. And it's written by Jacques Philippe, who's a French monk. And I found it very interesting because he emphasizes that aspect of Jesus being the model of the Beatitudes for us. But I would believe as well that, and the reason why the Beatitudes Gospel is used on All Saints' Day is because we also see it in the life of the saints. Pope John Paul II, Saint Pope John Paul II, did many great things for our church. But one of the things that I appreciate that he did is he encouraged us priests to preach the lives of the saints. Because he said, in their heroic lives, we learn about our own faith, and they help us to grow. And just like they're good role models, they're inspirations. And so I always enjoy talking about the lives of the saints, these amazing people who I believe also, in many ways, embrace the Beatitudes. Now, maybe not all 9 of them perfectly, but maybe one really terrifically. First of all, I want to clear up a little bit of our perhaps misknowledge about the saints. This is something we kind of talk about with the kids, actually. You know, I think there's a tendency, and, you know, I probably grew up with it too, and probably some of our kids experience that as well, where we kind of think of the saints as superheroes. Maybe you don't, but the kids probably do. You know, they have that great talent, you know, like Spider-Man has, you know, he can cling to buildings, or Superman has tremendous strength and can fly and all this. You know, think of like saints as being superheroes. Well, in a way, they're right. But don't think of the saints in terms of their powers. Don't think of them that way, because in many ways, saints are very ordinary people. They are given all of the same gifts we're given. They're not given extra gifts. I think in a way, they are more in tune with their gifts that they're given, the blessings they've received. And definitely their faith is much more focused. I think most of the saints have almost a laser focus on their faith. And it's all directed exactly to the right place. It's directed to God. They're single-minded. They're devoted. They have a priority. And it shows itself in their lives. So don't think of them as sort of like they're inevitably saints. Don't think of little, you know, like little St. Francis of Assisi running around as a 2-year-old. And it's like his mom going, oh, he's going to be a saint. You know, probably his mom probably thought the other way. You know, he's going to drive me crazy, you know. But don't, you know, what I guess I'm saying is saints aren't born in a way, they're made. But they come to their own fruition through their own experience with God. And their conversion, they're turning toward God. It's almost like, and many of the saints identify a moment in their lives when sort of they encounter Christ. Almost like the Annunciation. I think the Annunciation is sort of the perfect model. You know, Mary and the angel Gabriel coming to her. It always amazes me that Mary, first of all, she isn't flustered. You know, Mary's like, it's almost like Mary is sitting there saying, well, I knew you were going to come. What took you so long? You know, Mary is so cool. But her faith has led her to this point, and her devotion to God. And so when the angel appears and talks to her about God's will, God's plan, and invites her, Mary is so willing to step forward. I think that's the saints in a microcosm. That's their lives. So they are like perfect livers of the faith. So my definition of a saint is one who is attuned to God, focused on God, who accepts the love of God, and then who live their lives, their Christian life, as a true steward. They give back what they've received, and they have that knowledge. So they are people of the Beatitudes because they understand their blessings, and they put them to good use. Now, I'm going to reflect on these Beatitudes and mention a saint. So with each one, I'm going to point out to you a saint. So let me reflect on the lives of the saint with regard to each Beatitude. I'm actually going to start with the second one, which is, blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Years ago, I remember hearing a homily on the Beatitudes, and what stuck in my mind was what the priest said about this Beatitude. He said, when you mourn, it shows you love. And I thought of that, and I've thought about that many times over the years. You know, when you really mourn someone, you love them. And that love is sort of like, now, where does that love go? You know, that love, I've lost the person. There's a grief, there's a loss, and of course that's real. Mourning, I always say you get over grief. Grief's the immediate emotion. You know, the anger, the frustration, the sadness, the overwhelming feeling of you can't go on. That's grief. Grief passes. But don't you mourn your loved ones for your whole life? You know, your parents, your grandparents, people you loved in your lives who've gone before you. You mourn them because you love them. And I think mourning, the reason mourning is blessed is because it shows we have a heart that can love. And isn't that a blessing? Isn't that a great blessing? So blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. In other words, that mourning will have meaning. It won't be wasted. It won't be futile. It won't feel like it's not directed anywhere. the person I want to bring forth is St. Monica. Now, I know many people that pray to St. Monica. St. Monica was born in the year 322, so she goes back to the 4th century. She was born in North Africa. Very often she's depicted as an African, which is not correct. She was a Roman. The Romans colonized North Africa and then sent, colonists there. So she was of Roman stock. But she was raised as a Christian. So from her young age, she was a Christian. Her parents married her to a pagan man. Political purposes or expediency, almost arranged marriages in those days. So she didn't choose her husband out of love. He actually turned out to kind of be a rotten husband. They didn't really have a great marriage. In fact, in her married life, Monica, interestingly, I actually didn't know this until I was reading about her, she became an alcoholic in her marriage. Just think of that. In the 300s, her servants blackmailed her for her alcoholism against her husband, or with her husband. They blackmailed her with her husband against her. So there was a little tension there, a little difficulty in that marriage. She had a son named Augustine, and this is, of course, the great St. Augustine. He followed his father's footsteps. So Monica was very alone, very despairing. Her husband died, leaving her a widow. Augustine went to Italy to pursue his academic pursuits and his worldly pursuits, and Monica followed him. She followed him to Milan. But Monica knew as well that her job in life at that point as a widow was to oversee her son. And her great cause became her son's conversion. So she prayed. She became a prayer. She overcame her alcoholism, by the way, became a prayer, and turned her sorrow to a cause to really look after her son. She's considered the model of Christian motherhood, caring for her children, kind of loving despite the odds, and always praying on their behalf. In a very contemporary way, she speaks to many in the church, and the reason why I think many people I know of are very, in a way, devoted to her and pray to her, she's the patron saint of those whose children have left the faith. So I know a lot of people that pray for their children to St. Monica, their adult children. So she is that great model of motherhood, of fervent prayer, and one who mourned. She mourned her life, she mourned her son, and she turned it to something blessed. So if the Beatitude says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," she was consoled, because before her death, she saw her son Augustine. She died at the age of 65, by the way, 387. She saw her son baptized in the church. So all of her tears, all of her prayers were all rewarded in her son Augustine, who, of course, became one of the great figures in the church. So St. Monica, blessed are those who mourn. The next beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Righteousness can be seen as another word for justice. It's an understanding of kind of God's plan. What's God's world meant? What is the world meant to be in God's eyes? Righteousness is also those who receive their just due, who because of really gets back to their creation, who they are as children of God. So those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are kind of like fighters. And sometimes when you're a fighter in that way, there's a lot of emptiness, a lot of difficulty, a lot of feelings of, fatigue, despair, inability. It's a tough road to be a fighter for righteousness, a fighter for justice. And not just a fighter, but those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's even deeper than just fighting. That's longing for it. The one I'm going to put forward, the saint I'm going to put forward here is St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul was born in 1580. He was born in France. He had grown up on a farm, so he was a rural kid. And when he was a young man, his family was sort of struggling, on the farm and everything, but they had a rich aunt. And so the rich aunt died and left her estate to Vincent de Paul's family. So Vincent, being a young man, he was probably around 20 at the time, was kind of delegated the task of going to Italy to get Aunt Betty's estate, to reclaim it and bring it back to France. So he was given that task. So Vincent de Paul set off by boat from Marseille to go to Italy. They were waylaid by pirates, and Vincent was sold as a slave, interestingly. Who was the other famous saint who was sold as a slave? St. Patrick, sold as a slave as well. But Vincent de Paul was sold as a slave to Muslims in North Africa. Imagine that. So he lived for probably about 3 years in North Africa with Muslims. And he was encouraged to convert. And he always said, no, I'm a Christian, And luckily for him, he was able to persevere. He eventually found his way back to Italy and then back to France, where he entered the seminary to study to be a priest. He was ordained, and he made a prayer on his ordination day that he would always be a good and effective priest, one who would be there for the people. It was customary in those days, if you were ordained a priest in Paris, that your desire, what would be your desire? To stay in Paris, right? You'd want to, the good life and the nice places and all that stuff. And so most of the priests longed to stay in the city. Vincent de Paul told his bishop, he said, if it's all the same, I'd rather go out into the country because that's where I came from. So Vincent was a very bright man and would probably end up as a teacher or professor or something like that. And his bishop granted his request. So Vincent was sent out into the country to a small town. And what he saw was that disparity between urban and rural in the 1600s France, where, the rural people really struggled. It was a hard life in rural France. He saw the effects of poverty, and he saw that there was a lack of education. Even basic education was not possible. He saw the effect of that poverty and that lack of education on children and on family life, how difficult it was. Now, this is the 1600s. And ultimately, he saw that it had a great influence on the ability to really live the faith. If you're struggling for everything you have, living the faith can almost feel like a luxury at times. So his heart was moved, and he hungered and thirsted for righteousness for these people, these poor. And eventually, over time, he continued to minister to the people entrusted to him. And then he founded an order, the Vincentian priests. And they have a twofold mission, which is interesting. Their twofold mission is to care for the poor and to educate the clergy, educate seminarians. So if you know the Vincentian priests, they run seminaries and they work with the poor to this day. Because Vincent saw that those people of the rural areas, education was a key, and they needed to be educated in the faith. So if you work at educating the priests, then the priest can carry that to them, as he did. So his order, the Vincentians, flourished in France, caring for the poor, educating the clergy. He eventually founded a sister order of nuns, the Daughters of Charity. They're the flying nuns. Remember, with the big, headdresses with the wings? Those are the Daughters of Charity. They're Vincent de Paul's sister order. And he died at the age of 80, still working among the poor. So Vincent de Paul is a great model of one who almost that hunger and thirst for righteousness was almost turned on in him and then led him to a life dedicated to that. I have a great devotion to Vincent de Paul because St. Thomas Seminary in Denver, where I graduated from, was run by the Vincentian priests. So we saw saw that charism lived out there. But you think about, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. That hunger will be satisfied. You see what Jesus is saying there? So I'm sure at the age of 80, he was able to sort of lay down his burden and say, now it's someone else's. We also have Vincent de Paul societies, a number of them in Denver, based in parishes that work with the poor. So that ministry and that mission of Vincent de Paul continues. Now the next beatitude is, blessed are those who are merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Now, of course, this is an easy one for us to understand because we see Jesus, and we know Jesus was a man of mercy. We see that he always preached that. He extended that. I always think of the woman caught in adultery, remember, where Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. I don't hold your sins against you. But what does he tell her? But go and sin no more. Now it's up to you to do something about it. Mercy has been granted to you. Now you need to show that you've accepted it, received it, and now go live it. So blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. In other words, the merciful, those who extend it, are going to be able to receive it themselves or see it in their lives. A few years ago here in our church, we had the Year of Mercy. And it was to remind us. I remember Pope Francis speaking about this is one of the greatest gifts that Jesus extended to his people because it's a gift that keeps on giving. Mercy is like ripples in a pond. It extends out. So it comes from Jesus, but it goes even further. So blessed are those who are merciful, but we also know how hard that is, right? We're not very merciful at times. It gets caught up in our feelings and our anger and our grudges, and we don't want to extend that to others. It's hard to forgive people, let alone show mercy. It's a great quality that takes some effort and takes some work. The saint I want to mention here about the merciful is St. Louis of France. Louis of France was the king. He was the king of France, Louis IX. And he was born in 1222, lived in the 13th century. He was the son of a great warrior king, Louis VIII. And when his father died, Louis ascended the throne at the age of 12. So he became the king of France at the age of 12. And Louis, I don't know if this is fortunate for him or unfortunate for him, but he had a very domineering mother. Her name was Blanche of Castile. And she became the regent. A regent is someone who kind of oversees a minor king, one who's not of age. So until Louis became 18, his mother sort of ran the country, and she ran it, trust me. Blanche was a tough woman and a real authoritarian, but also very religious. Had a great life of devotion and piety, which she shared with her son. He became the king of France at the age of 12 and then reigned for 45 years. So he had a 45-year reign, died at the age of 57. It was a feudal society, where you had lords and ladies and nobles and, serfs and slaves. And it was a rough time, 13th century France. And yet Louis came to be seen by the people as the just king, J-U-S-T, a man of justice and a man of mercy. He used to preside at courts where the poorest of the poor of France could bring their grievances, and he would judge them as kind of a 12th century, 13th century Solomon almost. And he became renowned for his wisdom, for his insight, for his ability to almost like see the truth and understand it. And he was beloved by the people. And in settling these disputes, he always showed mercy, prayer, and compassion. He himself personally was a man of great devotion, dedicated to charity. Every night at dinner in the castle, he would invite 50 beggars to dinner every single evening. And very often he would serve them himself. So he took charity to great lengths where he did it himself. So he also was renowned throughout Europe. Other kings looked at Louis and said, I wish I could be like him. So he was very respected by everybody. He also went on 2 crusades, by the way, the 7th and 8th Crusades. And At the Eighth Crusade, he was taken prisoner and imprisoned. And it was actually there that he died. He died in Tunisia, in North Africa, of dysentery. Dysentery is very often the illness of war, with camps weren't hygienic in those days, and that was a very common way of dying. So he died at the age of, as I said, 57 in the year 1280. In 1297, 17 years later, he was canonized. So only 17 years after his death, he's canonized in 1297. He also eliminated dueling, where you could settle disputes by duel. See, in feudal France, that was the way. If this person had a grievance against this person, they could duel, and then the one who won was obviously the innocent one. That was the decision. Like only the innocent would win the duel. Kind of a weird system of justice, but that's what they did. He eliminated that, and it was interestingly St. Louis of France who was the first to presume that you were innocent until proven guilty. That was not the norm in the world up to that time. In his courts, you were innocent until proven guilty. That was a change. Again, is that showing mercy? Of course. So Louis of France is a great example of those who are merciful. He was shown mercy. He was shown mercy. The next beatitude is, blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. We think of clean of heart, and we think of purity, we think of an innocence. And there are many saints who probably fit this bill, but the one that jumped to my mind, believe it or not, was St. Stephen. St. Stephen was the first martyr of the church. He died in the year 36. Now, what year did Jesus die? 30, 31, something like that. So Stephen is just a few years after Jesus. Stephen was also, of course, one of the first deacons of the church. In the early days of the church, the apostles, as the church began to grow and more converts and more people joined the faith, it became almost overwhelming to the apostles to be able to do the work. So they picked 7 holy and pure men to assist them in the work. And those are the first 7 deacons of the church. And Stephen was one of those. Stephen was also a very fiery preacher. And what Stephen wanted to do is he wanted to proclaim Christ, and he was fearless in doing it. So he's in Jerusalem, and he would stand up in front of crowds, and crowds of angry Jews and angry other pagans and Gentiles and all kinds of things, and he would preach what Christ had preached and do it in a very fiery way. Stephen believed that he needed to make his life look like Christ. He totally conformed his life to that of Christ, to the best of his ability. He steadfastly preached the faith, kept to Christ's word, kept his heart clean. He was a man of innocence. And he was eventually, in the year 36, he was attacked by a crowd who he was preaching to, and they stoned him to death. And one of the people in the crowd was Paul. Paul witnessed the stoning of Stephen, which is interesting. And he died as Christ died. As Stephen was dying, it's in the Acts of the Apostles, as Stephen was dying, he saw Christ. And he said he saw the cross of Christ, and he saw Christ stretching out his hand to him. And the words he said were practically the same words of Christ. Into your hands I commend my spirit, which are the words of Jesus from the cross. All the followers heard those words and said, oh my gosh, he's dying just like Jesus did. That's a martyr. That became the definition of martyr, one who dies like Christ. So, as Christ died for the faith, martyrs do as well. So Stephen regarded as the first martyr. So as he was dying, he saw God. So when you hear, blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God, Stephen was rewarded in that way. The next beatitude is one very close to my heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. The reason why it's close to my heart is the saint I want to give as my example is the one I picked as my confirmation saint years ago, St. Peter Claver. And you know what? I've been a priest, I don't know how many years. I've never seen anybody pick Peter Claver, except me. So I keep waiting every year for someone to do so. I've had Peter the Apostle, of course, but not Peter Claver. Let me tell you Peter Claver's story. Peter Claver was the ultimate peacemaker. He was born in the year 1581, and he lived into the 17th century. He was born in Spain, and again, kind of from most of your great saints come out of almost like noble backgrounds. He was one of those. And he became a Jesuit in the Jesuit order. And, he's working as a Jesuit, and life is good, and he's enjoying his ministry and everything, but he got the itch. He got the itch to be a missionary. And, of course, the Jesuit order were great missionaries in those days, so he went to his superior and asked if he could become a missionary, if he could go to Colombia. Now, this is the early 1600s. And he goes to Colombia, and he goes to Colombia, and kind of in his mind, he's thinking, I'll minister to the Spanish colonials. The Spanish colonials who've gone to Spain, to Colombia to kind of, what Spanish colonials did, But he thought it would be that would be the ministry he would have. So he arrives in Colombia, in the city of Cartagena. Cartagena's on the coast. And I think even today, Cartagena is the largest city in Colombia, even though it's not the capital. The capital's Bogota, but Bogota's inland. Cartagena's on the coast. It's the largest city in Colombia. Cartagena, of course, we're familiar with, as the drug town. We remember that from several years back. Well, in Peter's day, Cartagena was the slavery town. So Cartagena's had a rough history. It was the place where the slaves were brought to South America from Africa, and where they were kept, and then the slave markets were there. Many slaves from Africa ended up in South America, not so much in the United States. They ended up in the Caribbean or South America as well. So Peter arrives in Cartagena, and he sees the slave traffic, and he's appalled. He's absolutely appalled. And he sees these people that are scared, that are lost, that don't know which end is up. They've literally been snatched. Probably a third of the slaves that were snatched out of Africa died en route. Only about 2/3 made their way to the New World. And he looked at them, and his heart just broke, because he saw them as souls, and he saw them as kind of almost lost souls. And he couldn't believe that God would abandon them, that couldn't happen. And he had a total conversion experience. So as a young priest, he made the decision that he would stay in Cartagena and minister to the slaves. He understood that he only had God's strength to draw upon. And he lived his entire life with really his order sort of abandoned him and said, well, if you're going to do that, you're kind of on your own, because that wasn't in their plans. So he did it with no support from anyone, except what was offered by well-meaning well-wishers, people that he kind of lived on charity. And he lived his whole life out on the docks of Cartagena, ministering to the slave boats as they came into the port. He baptized 300,000 people. Can you imagine that? I think, it's an amazing conversion that he had. And at the age of 74, he died there on the port of Cartagena of the plague. And his funeral was held in Cartagena, and literally the entire city turned out. Even though he had lived a very solitary life and done his work very quietly, everybody knew him. And they respected him, and they acknowledged this great saint. He was one of the first saints canonized from the New World. And very appropriately today, Peter Claver is, you know what he's the patron saint of? Racial equality. I think he is the most timely saint of the world right now. His feast day is September 9th. On September 9th, we did a special mass here for racial equality. So I think, but again, it speaks to the man and it speaks to the beatitude. Blessed are the peacemakers. He made the decision to literally change his life to do this. They will be called children of God. Children of God. The next beatitude, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The one that jumped to my mind here was St. Kateri Tekakwitha. She was born the year Peter Claver died, interestingly, 1656. And she was born in upstate New York. She was a Mohawk Indian. And she was raised in her tribe. And it was about that time in the late 1600s that her tribe became Christianized, or that had missionaries came to them. And she made the decision as a very young woman that she would convert to this new faith. Her parents, her family disowned her. Adding to the fact that she became a Christian was the fact also that she took a vow of chastity at the time of her conversion. So she basically said, I'm not going to marry. Well, her parents had already lined up her marriage, and she refused. And I'm just saying this from a historical perspective. She was seen as having no worth if she wasn't going to marry. Like a single woman had no value in the tribe in those days. But she resisted, and she was shunned by her family, and eventually by the tribe. She lived on the outskirts of the tribe. Eventually, at the age of about 20, a young man from a neighboring tribe came to the village, and he had also converted. And he told her that he was going to Canada. And the reason why was because there were Christians there. And they could go there and live among their fellow Christians, because they were the only Christians in their tribe. So she made the decision to leave her family. She was also shunned because she had smallpox. And smallpox, when you recover from it, leaves scars. And she was no longer beautiful. So she was sort of ridiculed for losing her beauty. So she's got all these things working against her. She's a Christian, she's not going to marry, and she's had smallpox. So she left with this man. They went to Canada, pursued by her father, by the way. But they managed to elude him. They got to Quebec. They came to Quebec City. And there she fell in with some Christians who took her in. And she became a woman of great prayer, living a life of simplicity and holiness. She would do acts of charity, and she would serve and help the people in the neighborhood. And she became very admired. People looked at her and saw, someone who was very holy. And her holiness shone to those. But I thought, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. For the sake of righteousness. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. She died, by the way, in 1680, the age of 24. So you can imagine an exciting life at such a young age. And she was canonized, about 10, 12 years ago by Pope John Paul II. So when we say, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I think Kateri, the word Kateri is Catherine, by the way. She took the name after her conversion. She had a native name, but she took the name Catherine. She was one who pursued, heaven. She pursued it in her life. The last beatitude is actually the first. And I'm going to go back to the first. It's a combination, actually, of the first two. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Meekness is often interpreted as humble. And we know Jesus preaches humility often and says it's one of the most important virtues. Humility places us in the right relationship with God. because we know that from God all things flow, and we acknowledge our blessings, and we acknowledge our place before God, that we are created, that we are not creator. We place ourselves in that proper perspective with regard to God. And humility is also a brutal honesty about oneself and about the world. So when they say meekness sounds like a doormat quality, right? I always think meek and I think of a doormat, someone who always agrees and never stands up for themselves, and you think of that. But that can't be anything further from the truth of what Jesus is speaking of with regard to humility and meekness. And then you hear the beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, which again is about humility. It's about acknowledging what I need. Being poor in spirit, poverty of spirit is knowing that I need what God gives me. I need that, and living that out. This, of course, is the ultimate reward for all Christian believers, is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus says those people, the humble, those with poverty of spirit, the meek, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. That's a promise. It's a great promise. The saint, of course, I thought of here is Therese of Lisieux. Therese of Lisieux is kind of the model of the meekness and the humility of God. She was born in the year 1873. She was born in Lisieux, and she was again born to upper middle class family. Great saints always come from the upper middle class, it seems. But her father was a jeweler, which in those days was, kind of a good profession. She was one of 7 children, the baby. Actually, that was her nickname among her family as kids. They called her Baby. Because she was the youngest. Her 2 older brothers both died young, leaving 5 girls. All 5 girls became nuns, by the way. And her mother died when she was 8 years old. And it changed her life completely. She said in her biography that she never recovered from her mother's death. Never recovered. So she's got mourning there as well. She never recovered. It changed her life. It turned her from being a spoiled, rotten baby kid to being someone now that began to think about her life. And it was really at that age where she said her spiritual life began to develop. She was fortunate because her father was such a devoted man, a very devout man who doted on her, but who also was a man of great faith. And about 6 years ago, Pope Benedict, I believe, canonized her parents. So St. Therese of Lisieux's parents have been canonized as saints, as a couple. And it wasn't because they were the parents of St. Therese of Lisieux. It's because of their life, their faithfulness, the household. They're kind of saints of a holy household or a holy family. That's why they're kind of regarded. Auguste and Zélie Martin. Her last name was Martin, M-A-R-T-I-N, pronounced Martin. So Auguste and Zélie Martin are her parents. And she became a very moody child. Moody in the sense that she became quiet and reserved after she'd been such a bubbly, bratty kid. She became quiet and reserved, very prayerful. And when she was about 13 years old, her father took her on a trip to Rome to see the Pope. And so they traveled to Rome, and Therese's great goal was to enter the convent. Her 4 older sisters had all entered the convent. So Therese wanted to follow in their footsteps. So she was 13 years old. In those days, you had to be 16 to enter a convent. So they were at an audience of the Pope in the Vatican. This is Pope Leo XIII. And Therese, it came to the point where the Pope was blessing the individual people that were there for the audience. Therese broke out of the line, went to the Pope, and asked for special permission to enter the convent in Lisieux at 13. Like, Pope, do me a favor. You can make a phone call for me back to Lisieux and let me enter the convent. And Pope Leo looked at her, and he said, in God's time, you will enter at the proper thing. You need to go home and be dutiful to those who are in authority over you. So in other words, your parents, your family, the priest in town. You need to go and be a faithful person, and God will answer your prayer, but in due time. So she was a little disappointed, and she returned to Lisieux and then continued to badger her father, and finally she wrote a letter to the Pope, same Pope, Leo XIII, who remembered her, and eventually the Pope kind of talked to the Mother Superior in Lisieux at the Carmelite convent and she was allowed to enter at the age of 15. So she was allowed to enter a year younger than normal. So she entered the convent beginning 1888 and lived a very undramatic life. Her life was really no different from any other nun in the convent. And Carmelites, of course, in those days were cloistered. They lived behind walls. They didn't go out in public. They prayed. They stayed very solitary in their lives. But her very witness of faith was such an inspiration to her fellow nuns. Amazingly, these elderly nuns who had, seen it all, done it all, heard it all, were captivated by this woman, this young woman, who was clearly holier and led such a life of holiness that it was visual. They could see it. Eventually, when she was in her early 20s, she contracted pneumonia, and then it was discovered that she had tuberculosis. So she became sort of kind of a quasi-invalid. Her last few years of her life were kind of very, very quiet. Right before her death, about a year before her death, her Mother Superior, who's named Mother Agnes, went to her and said, "Therese, I want you to write your memoirs." Now, she's in her 20s. Who has memoirs in their 20s, right? And Therese said no. She said, "I don't feel like, my life means anything. I don't have anything to offer." And her Mother Superior said, "No, Therese, this is under obedience. You have to do it." So Therese spent the last year of her life writing her autobiography. And it is called The Story of a Soul, and it is one of the classics of Catholic spiritual literature. And if you haven't read it, you should. I've read it about 6 times, I think. Always learn something new. This is a young woman who just speaks from the heart. And she speaks about her relationship with God. She speaks about her relationship with the sisters. She speaks about her prayer. She speaks about so many things. Her heart just pours out. And one of the things she speaks about in there, she said she's trying to find her vocation. It's like she looked at her life and said, what is my vocation? Yes, there's a vocation in being a nun and being a great prayer, as the Carmelites were. But she says, what is my special call? What does God want from me? She was desperate. She wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to go to the Holy Land and be a missionary, and she couldn't because of her health, of course. But to this day, she's the patron saint of missionaries because she prayed every day for missionaries and for the mission work of the church. She couldn't do it herself, but she prayed for it. And she finally realized, and you read it in her biography, she finally realized what her vocation was. Her vocation was to love. And I thought, I was thinking last week, the great commandment, love God above all things, your neighbor as yourself. And her name popped into my mind, and I thought, this is one who found her vocation to love. She perfectly fulfilled the great commandment. She describes a situation in her biography that's really intriguing. She describes a situation where there was an elderly nun in the community who no one liked. This nun was cranky, she was irascible, she was stubborn, she made everybody's life miserable. And Therese thought, I'm going to win her over. I'm going to kill her with kindness and love. And Therese became her mission to win over this sister. And every time she ran into her, she'd smile, and she'd do little chores for her, and she'd help her out, and she'd do all this stuff. And finally, one day, the older sister kind of looked at her and said, Therese, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you doing all this? Who are you? And why are you bothering me with this way? And Therese goes, because I love you. And the woman supposedly broke into tears. No one had ever told her that. No one had ever told her that. And the amazing thing about St. Therese is, again, this very quiet life in a cloistered convent, but that conversion to love, her encounter with the difficult nun. She said to this nun, when I see you, I see Christ. And that's like perfect Christian living. Her conversion of heart was complete in her living out the great commandment. And of course, at the age of 24, she died of tuberculosis. She was revered for her meekness of heart, her meekness of spirit, her humility. And she could have been forgotten, just another good nun. But amazingly, we had her biography. It was kept within the community for a number of years and used by the community in inspiring ways. You know, they would assign the young novices to read her biography, but it was not published. It wasn't published outside of the community until the 1920s. So it wasn't until the 1920s that her story got out there. And it was the Mother Superior who allowed it to be published because she felt it was so important that it was of value to the church at large. So her biography was printed, and it was there that the devotion to her really took off. She's always been very special to me because my grandmother had a great devotion to her. My father has told me that when he was young, he remembers sitting at dinner, and they'd always do prayers after meals. You'd grace before meal, but they'd do prayers after meals as well. And my grandmother would always say, and for the canonization of Therese of Lisieux. She'd always add that prayer, you know, because she was not canonized until a little later. But my dad said he remembers that growing up, my grandmother being very devoted to her. You know, one of the things that came back to me was, and I'm thinking of that during this pandemic, where I went to the seminary in Missouri at Conception Seminary, which is Benedictine monks, 2 miles away across the road was the Benedictine Sisters, the convent. Benedictine Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. They used to be cloistered, now they're not, but they're still a community that is still doing well, and they have younger nuns and everything. And we used to go over and visit. We'd go over every once in a while and have prayer with the nuns. You know, we'd join in them with Vespers and evening prayer. It's in Clyde, Missouri. Our hosts that we use at Sunday Mass here come from the sisters. Sisters make them in Clyde. And, you know, everything at a convent is, you know, so clean. You know, everything is so efficient and so clean. You know, monasteries, not so much. But the women, they know how to do it well. The convents are always, you know, really terrific places. So you'd love to walk around, and they had a couple of chapels that you could visit, and they had a museum that you could visit. They used to run a girls' school that had been closed down, and the thing that always captivated me was their cemetery. Out beyond the church was a cemetery, and of course, you know, the graves were laid out, and it looked like Fort Logan. You know, they were laid out just perfectly symmetrical and everything, and all the nuns going back to the 1800s that had died in this community, all buried there. And you'd walk in the cemetery and stuff, and it always struck me because you'd walk along, and the nuns are buried there in chronological order, so you could see the years as it goes along. So you'd be going along, and it struck me at the time. You get to like 1918, and it's, you know, there's like 8 nuns in a row. 1918, 1918, 1918, 1918, 1918, 1918. And I thought, they all died in the Spanish flu. And, you know, you think of these nuns and the work they do, and, you know, the Spanish flu pandemic, hit the community because they all died within about 4 months of each other. It's come back to me very often, but I also think of these, you know, very devoted women who continue in their work and their lives to continue to live them out. And Therese of Lisieux is the perfect model of that. God exalted this little nun, this little woman, as he does with all his saints. And the amazing thing about Therese of Lisieux is the honor that's been accorded to her. Pope John Paul II said she was the most important saint of the last 100 years of the church. It's quite an honor. And Pope St. John Paul II as well declared her a doctor of the church. There are 26 of them in the history of the church, 3 women. Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, and Therese of Lisieux. And it means that their writings have added to the theological work of the church. Her writing is her autobiography. That's all she ever wrote. She didn't write a work of theology. Her theology was her life. That was it. There's actually one other book that I have a copy of. It's interesting. She, the bishop of Lisieux in that area, when Therese was a nun there at Lisieux, the bishop contacted the Mother Superior, and he said, "I would like your nuns to do a project for me." And the Mother Superior said, "What would that be?" And he said, "Well, you know, we have these young priests, And some of them are struggling, adjusting to priesthood. And he said, it'd be wonderful if your nuns could write them, could share letters with them, like be a pen pal. Because the sisters never left the convent, so they never actually meet face to face. But if they could, write letters of encouragement, and then the priest could write to them and ask for their prayers. And he said it'd be a nice connection to have. So the Mother Superior said that would be fine. She'd be happy to do that. And she thought of Therese, because Therese was kind of an invalid. She couldn't do a lot of physical work. So she asked Therese if she'd be one of these sisters that communicated with the priest. And Therese said she would. And the priest was Father Martin. And he was struggling. He was struggling as a priest. Filled with doubt, filled with just all kinds of things. Struggling with his faith, struggling with priesthood. And he began to communicate with St. Therese. Imagine her as a pen pal. I mean, that's like the most wonderful thing in the world. Well, years after her death, he published the letters. So there's actually a book out there, too, called like Letters from Therese or something like that. And it's the letters back and forth between the priest and the nun. So there are 2 works of hers. But in that, she was named a doctor of the church. So again, blessed are those who are poor of spirit, the humility, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. So you think about Therese, her single-mindedness, her focus, her desire to serve God in whatever way she was able or capable, and it led to her great reward. So I guess I've just shared with you a little bit of the Beatitudes and a little bit of the lives of the saints. And I hope you have a new understanding of saints a little bit too. Because, St. Thomas Aquinas was the famous one who said, grace builds on nature. And I think when you think of saints, you think grace builds on nature. The saints are people, nature. They're people of flesh and blood created by God, and grace builds upon them. And, we're fortunate too because grace builds on us. And grace is received, of course, in the sacraments. When we receive the body and blood of Christ, we receive grace. And does it build on our own nature? That's an exciting thing. But their willingness to be open to the will of God, to trust, to have faith, and then to let it live is exalted. And that's the mystery of the Beatitudes. Today, as we know their lives inspire us, their life of virtue also challenges us to follow them. And I think that's what Pope John Paul II said, when we preach the lives of the saints, their lives inspire us and challenge us. And as we celebrate the Feast of All Saints on Sunday, we will thank them. I think, a celebration is always a thanksgiving. It's always a time to thank the saints for their place in our lives. They show us the faith of God, and maybe more importantly, they give us a glimpse of the life of heaven. So we have to be brave in our faith and in our practice and look for opportunities to live the Beatitudes. And when you're feeling meek, or you're feeling mourning, or you're feeling, that you're thirsting after a righteousness that you feel will never be realized, know that is where blessing is found. So that's my final thoughts on the Beatitudes. They are unexpected blessings, not in ways we'd see, but in the way God intends them to be truly blessed. Okay? Any questions or any thoughts? It's just about 7:05, so thank you for listening. And again, the 8 Doors of the Kingdom, Reflections on the Beatitudes, if you want to check that out. Or St. Therese's biography, I can't recommend that enough, Story of a Soul. Okay, so thanks a lot. Oh, Dorothy, you have a question? That's right. Yep. The